I've had a hell of a time analyzing Rolling Stone's 500 greatest albums of all time list, and guess what? It ends here. In previous parts, I picked albums that interested me, but in this final section, I'm going through each of the top 10 albums as named by Rolling Stone, and I'm giving my thoughts and opinions on their placement and respective legacies. Just remember, this is my opinion, and every time I give analysis on music, it's nothing more than just my opinion. Rolling Stone had their own collective opinion too when doing this list, including when they revised it the few times that they did since the list's original iteration in 2003. This is it. This is the end. Let's talk about these 10 albums. Before we get into that, make sure you hit the subscribe button for new content, and if you see or hear something that resonates with you, or maybe not, feel free to leave a comment below. So the 10th greatest album of all time, according to Rolling Stone, is Lauryn Hill's The Miseducation of Lauryn Hill from 1998. Last summer, Apple Music actually named this their top album of all time, which I really thought was actually a stretch. But I think number 10 seems a lot more feasible and appropriate, and let's talk about why. This album was celebrated right out of the gate following the dissolution of her previous group Fugees, and at the time each of the members of that legendary trio was embarking on their own solo career. Wyclef Jean was already making the rounds in the industry as early as 1997, and Pras had his moment in the spotlight during the summer of 1998 with Ghetto Superstar. Lauryn Hill took a little bit of extra time, but eventually delivered the most significant output of the three Fugees members. The Miseducation of Lauryn Hill is a concept album that explores love, relationships, self-awareness, and evolution. And the album, it really isn't hip-hop at its core, but it's also not fully neo-soul or contemporary R&B, while also remaining accessible, which in turn captivated the music world. Doo-Wop That Thing was the leading single and was probably the song that represented hip-hop the most. The track Lost Ones gets the album off to a serious but confident start that really is reminiscent of some of the Fugees' work. X Factor is a beautiful neo-soul cut that I really can't get enough of. You have D'Angelo shining on the track Nothing Even Matters, and the album closes with two of the most beautiful cuts on here, Can't Take My Eyes Off of You and Tell Him. As a whole, the album really does get off to a fast start, and the first four songs are absolutely excellent, but it is front-loaded, which is a bit of an issue, and I sort of tend to drift off in the second half of this record. Following the song When It Hurts So Bad, things unfortunately start to run together a little for me, and while Lauryn Hill keeps things very soothing and calm, there are moments where I actually get bored. It's just hard to keep my attention for 80 minutes, which is pretty much my main knock on this record, which is otherwise very good. While I understand the classroom scenes or skits that come at the end of a few tracks and how they contribute to the album's concept, they also bloat the record. In addition, some of the tracks really overstay their welcome. In particular, I Used to Love Him, which would have been just as effective at 4 minutes as it is at 6. Things like this, I don't know, man, they just make the album seem eternal. I did listen to this album again recently, and no lie, when I started the record, when Lost Ones came on, there was actually snow and ice on the ground. And by the time I got to the end of the album with Tell Him, the trees were blooming and the grass was green. So while it's a great album, the approximately 6-week runtime really does annoy me. And it's not just this album, it's really any record that requests more than an hour of my time. It just can be hard to get into. Some I can make an exception for. This one, it's kind of tough. So number 10 overall, I get it. I mean, from a critical standpoint, they've been all over this thing since the moment it came out. And the Recording Academy has been too. Let's not forget that she won, 5 or 6 Grammys for this back in early 1999? But as much as I see the greatness of The Miseducation of Lauryn Hill, it doesn't come anywhere close to my top 10. But this isn't about me. It's a pick that makes sense, even if I don't necessarily agree with it. It is one of the most critically acclaimed albums of all time, and it's no surprise to see it where it is. According to Rolling Stone, the number 9 best album of all time is Bob Dylan's Blood on the Tracks from 1975. This has long been one of his most celebrated albums, and while I'm not the hugest Bob Dylan fan, I have spent my share of time with his music. A lot of it was a big part of my childhood. My dad listened to a lot of Bob Dylan, and I have carried certain parts of his discography into my adulthood. Blood on the Tracks is most celebrated for how deep and emotional that Bob Dylan got. Many speculate that this was a direct result of the end of his marriage, though Dylan has actually denied this in interviews. It's definitely a sad album that looks back on lost love on songs like If You See Her, Say Hello and You're a Big Girl Now. But there are also a number of upbeat, energetic storytelling cuts that Dylan is known for. Tangled Up in Blue is a great example of this and is among the most celebrated songs in his catalog. You have fun, weirdo tracks like Lily, Rosemary, and the Jack of Hearts. You have a more abstract cut in the strange but satisfying Idiot Wind. And then there's the use of the literary tactic of switching from the third to the first person in Simple Twist of Fate. Dylan put a ton of thought and calculation into the songwriting for Blood on the Tracks. It's also very well sequenced for an album that's not a concept album, starting things off in an upbeat manner on Tangled Up in Blue, before kind of toying with the listener's emotions as the album goes on. If You See Her, Say Hello, and Shelter from the Storm, which are the album's third and second to last tracks, they are among the saddest and darkest that you will hear in Bob Dylan's catalog. And then right at the end of the album, A Moment of Bright brightness is offered on Buckets of Rain, which closes out the album with a proud resolution. Personally, I've always gravitated towards Bob Dylan's earlier work, particularly his work in the mid-60s, including Highway 61 Revisited and Blonde on Blonde. After he had that motorcycle accident in 1966, his style just kind of seemed to change. And I also know that most of his work from that time didn't really see the same critical praise as most of his work from earlier in the 60s. Blood on the Tracks was so remarkable in part because it was kind of a return to form, to the style that helped him explode in popularity and critical acclaim about 10 years prior. It showed that he was not just a product of his original generation, and he had serious staying power as an artist. While it's not in my top 10, Blood on the Tracks is a fantastic album, and I completely understand why Rolling Stone included it in their top 10. On to number 8, we actually have a soundtrack. This is actually one of the most famous and celebrated soundtracks of all time, that of the movie Purple Rain, done by Prince. While this isn't a traditional album per se, and you don't see many soundtracks on most best of all time lists, Purple Rain is kind of a staple at the top of most critical lists that you'll ever see. And rightfully so, as this is Prince at the peak of what was an amazing career. He was really on a roll in the 80s. Between 1980's Dirty Mind and 1987 Sign of the Times, he went on an absolute tear and released some of the most influential and awesome albums of all time, in my opinion. Right in the middle of this, Prince, who was one of the biggest names in pop music by the mid-80s, was cast in this musical film, Purple Rain. While the movie itself is a little dated and average at best, Prince did put together the score for this film, which is pretty much the biggest output that you'll get from this movie. But the replay value of the actual soundtrack is just unbelievable. One thing that made Prince so great was his ability to define the Minneapolis sound and mix it seamlessly with other genres such as synth pop, soul, and funk. Prince managed to do this pretty much on all of his 80s albums that were so successful, but really took it to a new level on the Purple Rain soundtrack. And again, this movie is a musical, so automatically off the bat there's more of a dramatic flair to some of the songs here. Darling Nikki plays off of some sexual melodrama, and while it does have some pretty debaucherous lyrics, its energy, demeanor, and attitude are straight out of a Broadway show. While this soundtrack's deeper cuts are definitely intriguing, it's ultimately defined by 3 of its biggest tracks: the infectious opener Let's Go Crazy, When Doves Cry, which is one of the most iconic songs of the 80s, and the amazing, stunning closer and title track, which features some of the best guitar work of Prince's illustrious career. Purple Rain is just such an excellent collection of Prince's versatile and commanding sound, which somehow remained accessible. The synth funk and guitar-based soul elements that help define the Minneapolis sound are extremely prominent here, and these are the things that make Prince's music just so lovable. Let's not forget that he was also the main instrumentalist, arranger, composer, and performer throughout. Prince actually won an Oscar in 1985 for original song score, which just goes to show you how well executed and widely influential this soundtrack is. As far as Prince's discography goes, I'd probably rank Sign of the Times ahead of this one, but Purple Rain, it's one of the best soundtracks ever, and it deserves a placement on Rolling Stone's top 10 list, 100%. Alright, number 7 on Rolling Stone's list is an album that I think is one of the best executed pop records of all time, and that album is Fleetwood Mac's Rumors from 1977. This has forever been one of the most critically acclaimed records to see the light of day, and honestly I could see why. It's right up there with The Miseducation of Lauryn Hill, The Dark Side of the Moon, Thriller, and a few others that music publications often consider one of the best. Funny story, Fleetwood Mac, they actually really used to annoy me. I grew up near Philadelphia, and we had a classic rock station down there, 102.9 WMGK, which was known as Magic 102.9 in the 90s when I was growing up. They used to play Fleetwood Mac and Stevie Nicks ad nauseum. My parents would listen to this radio station every time we got in the car, so I got a heavy dose of Fleetwood Mac growing up. As an adult, after some time away from their material, I've really grown to appreciate how they can make just such simple pop music and still sound so fucking good. The band had a pretty robust career for about 10 years ahead of Rumors, but in 1975, singer Stevie Nicks joined the band for their self-titled album, and she proved to be a secret weapon, throwing an already great band over the top. Her beautifully gravelly voice and American twang brought a new element to the band's brand of intricately crafted soft and pop rock, and in the case of Rumors, she shines at the most on songs like Dreams, which is one of their biggest songs. Her vocal harmonies with Lindsey Buckingham on songs like I Don't Wanna Know give an already infectious upbeat track a whole new fun aspect. My personal favorites are the opener Secondhand News and of course the iconic Go Your Own Way. The album kind of does end on a slow note, as Oh Daddy and Gold Dust Woman really aren't the strongest tracks on here. Listen, I don't normally go for softer pop music, but Fleetwood Mac was so good at executing it on the album Rumors that they roped me into a type of music that usually isn't in my rotation. This is some of the most effective pop music of all time, and while it did have a certain amount of attitude, it was mostly bright and upbeat. This is interesting considering some of the rumored turmoil that was going on in the personal lives of the band members during the time of recording, and how much they would end up getting thrust into the spotlight during this time. Great music is often made under duress, so perhaps that's why Rumors is such a fantastic album. Top 10 of all time, I don't think I agree with that, but I cannot be mad at this placement, as Rumors is an awesome record. The number 6 album of all time, according to Rolling Stone, is Nirvana's second album, 1991's Nevermind. One of the most recognizable grunge albums of all time from a band that transcends the term iconic. This is a great record, but again, it's hard for me to see this in the top 10 of all time. I think of the grunge movement and I think of awesome, incredible bands like Alice in Chains and Soundgarden, and decent bands like Pearl Jam, Screaming Trees, and Stone Temple Pilots. And for some reason, when I think of Nirvana, even though their music is about as grunge as you can get, I think of them rising above that local Seattle scene and taking over the world. They didn't seem like they were part of that intimate group of bands that made grunge so interesting. Kurt Cobain had a knack for writing some of the catchiest, most anthemic, and yet most depressing songs, also remaining emotional, sarcastic, and raw in his own way. He was a once-in-a-generation songwriter, and Smells Like Teen Spirit is his signature composition. So how do you keep an audience's interest after leading an album with this song that would become probably one of the most iconic of the entire decade? I'll tell you how. You follow it up with grunge and alt-rock classics like Bloom, Come As You Are, Breed, and Lithium. I prefer the deeper cuts off of Nevermind, as I personally believe a lot of the marquee tracks off this album have been overplayed, but they're still great. Drain You and Stay Away are underrated gems, and Territorial Pissings kind of pay tribute to the band's punk rock roots. I do think Something in the Way is a stunning closer, and I think it's one of the 5 best Nirvana songs. I really don't think there's anything I can say about Nevermind that hasn't already been said. It features some of the most overplayed songs in music history, and yet every time I put them on, I find myself vibing. I'll admit, there's a ton of nostalgia in Nirvana's music. Some of my earliest musical memories are tied into the grunge movement, as that was sort of exploding when I was just a young kid. So this album kind of does manage to hit me in the feels a little bit, and maybe that's why Rolling Stone puts it so high, is because it's so nostalgic for so many people. As far as grunge itself goes, I strongly prefer Alice in Chains' Dirt, which is an unbelievable record that didn't fall anywhere on this list, which is total nonsense. Once again, this is a big publication placing iconic artists who have achieved crazy amounts of record sales over some of the deeper artists who put out way better stuff. Having said that, I do have a soft spot for Nirvana's Nevermind. I just can't hate it. Number 5 on Rolling Stone's list is probably the top 10 pick I agree with the most, and that's the Beatles' Abbey Road. The last of the Beatles albums in the 60s and coming at the end of a 5-album run that essentially defined the Beatles' legacy, Abbey Road is, in my eyes, the finest LP from one of the most legendary discographies of all time. The Beatles were in peak form in the second half of the 60s, and fresh off of their titanic double album, The White Album, they stepped the experimentation back a little bit on Abbey Road while also pumping in kind of a progressive pop element, which showed some of the best songwriters on the planet in Lennon and McCartney getting even better in the songwriting department. Everything about Abbey Road is just so special, all the way down to the album art, which is one of the most recognizable album covers in music history. Now, it's just my opinion, but I think that slightly progressive twist that was added to their normal brand of upbeat, quirky pop really was the main ingredient that throws Abbey Road over the top. They sequenced this album perfectly, starting with a more laid-back, bluesy song in Come Together, which is one of their smoothest and coolest tracks of all time. Things get a little more whimsical, a la songs like Yellow Submarine, as we get into Maxwell's Silver Hammer and Octopus's Garden, the latter of which was actually written and sung by Ringo Starr. I Want You, She's So Heavy is the literal and figurative centerpiece of the album, and it drones out the A-side on the excellent main riff, kind of just plodding and making the listener anxious and building tension before just abruptly cuts off. And then the B-side starts on a completely different note as Here Comes the Sun pumps in a warm psychedelic element. Because it's Baroque pop that is just so lush and sentimental and perfectly executed, there are some less exciting moments kind of in the middle of the B-side before the album closes on an absolute tear, as the run including Polythene Pam, She Came In Through the Bathroom Window, Golden Slumbers, Carry the Weight, and The End are excellent bite-sized little songs that kind of run into each other sort of as one big extended track. Just like Nirvana's Nevermind, I think that enough has been said about this album over the years. I really don't have too much new to offer. I just think it's the Beatles' finest, and while you could probably make a case for any album between Revolver and Abbey Road as their top record, this album just shows the band on kind of another level of songwriting and execution. The psychedelic influence in the writing of Lennon and McCartney is just such a charm, and George Harrison provides some of the best guitar work of his career on here without getting in the way. Abbey Road is perfectly balanced, it's lush, it's warm, and in my eyes, it's the best album from one of the most celebrated bands in music history, so I love Abbey Road at number 5. At number 4, we have Songs in the Key of Life by Stevie Wonder, which is widely regarded as one of the best albums of all time by many people in publications. It's one of the most passionate, soulful, and yet accessible albums of all time. For me, personally, it can get a little bit too upbeat and spiritual in spots, but there would be something wrong with me me as a music listener if this album did not captivate me when listening to it. Coming out in 1976, this was a very highly anticipated album. Stevie Wonder had already carved his reputation by this time, and he was one of the most active and successful stars in pop music. Apparently, the recording process for this album was pretty tedious, and Wonder's perfectionist tendencies led record execs and the general population to have to wait for this album as things got delayed. The wait seems to have been worth it, as Stevie Wonder blesses us with a double album full of an hour and 45 minutes of material and a supplemental EP entitled A Something's Extra. So yeah, this album is busy, it's long, it's an event. I am a vocal opponent of double albums and egregiously long records. I think there's so much music out there in the world to discover, to revisit, and I think double albums eat up time that could be spent elsewhere. That said, sometimes they work, and in the case of Songs in the Key of Life, it makes sense because Stevie had so much to offer here. He unfolds a number of different moods and lyrical themes, and while there are extremely happy, lush, beautiful songs like the nearly perfect Isn't She Lovely, there are also moments of vivid nostalgia on songs like I Wish, and tributes to his musical heroes on the infectious Sir Duke. But there's also quite a bit of stark political and social commentary as well. Village Ghetto Land, Pastime Paradise, and Black Man are three of the most powerful cuts on here, each calling out injustices within society. And then you have passionate, emotional songs about romantic love and love for humanity in general on cuts like Ordinary Pain, Another Star, and As. All of this gives the album such major versatility. That's one of its charms, and if you're gonna do a double album, this is the way to do it. From a musical standpoint, this thing is on another level. It's a snapshot of perfectly executed 70s progressive soul mixed with funk. Some of the synths and bass lines are just so infectious. Take the middle passage of the song Ordinary Pain, for instance. That's a groove. You have dramatic strings and decadent synths on Pastime Paradise. And I gotta go back to Isn't She Lovely, as Stevie Wonder's harmonica solo is just perfect. Even Have a Talk with God is one that I really, really love. Let's make it clear, I'm not a religious person, so this song does not resonate with me lyrically at all. But man, I just love listening to it. It's just so upbeat, enjoyable. It just sounds so good. The soundscapes on here, they're stunning, pretty much every song. And the use of electric piano on this album is one of its signature traits. The Fender Rhodes and the RMI Electra were used on most songs. Songs in the Key of Life is one of those great musical gifts that we as a society have been privileged to receive. We all know the talent and the potential of Stevie Wonder, but along with his 1973 album Intervisions, this is about as good as it gets from one of the greatest artists of all time. This album is powerful enough to soften up the hardest of souls, to get the most robotic of us to just groove and dance, all while providing a real, authentic message of love, nostalgia, tribute, political and social commentary, and most of all, hope. And number 4 of all time for Stevie Wonder's Songs in the Key of Life makes perfect sense to me. I was pretty intrigued by Rolling Stone's number 3 pick, which is Canadian singer-songwriter Joni Mitchell's 1971 record Blue. Of the top 10 albums, this one's probably the least traditional or least accessible, as it truly is some intricately written and uniquely delivered contemporary folk music. While Joni Mitchell is one of the most celebrated singer-songwriters of all time, some do find her voice a little bit off-putting, and before I had heard too much of her, that was sort of my first impression. She employs a sometimes high-pitched mezzo-soprano style, which is mostly soothing, though she does go pretty high up in the register sometimes, which can admittedly be a little bit grating, but the writing, the storytelling, the imagery, and the emotion that she paints through her lyrics, that's really what makes this album as celebrated as it is. She takes what Bob Dylan was mostly known for, and on Blue, she takes it a step further. The album, which is extremely candid and telling from a lyrical standpoint, was influenced by the dissolution of her relationship with singer-songwriter Graham Nash, and was also influenced by the culmination of another relationship she had with another singer-songwriter, James Taylor. Her lyrics, her delivery, they're just so vivid, they're so unique, and she calmly commands the listener's attention with her very prominent vocal style. There are actually a ton of lovable moments on this record. I say actually like it's some surprise. This is a great album. The song All I Want, which chronicles moments of her relationship with James Taylor, and also the song A Case of You are my favorites. But this album goes beyond the lyrics and the writing. There's some clever, whimsical musical moments throughout. In the song River, she speaks about Christmas time and decorating, and employs a soft, soothing piano which kind of teases the melody for Jingle Bells. There are cool little moments like this throughout Blue, and it really is one of the album's main charms. But number 3 of all time? That's some serious business. That makes this a really thought-provoking pick. I will say that Joni Mitchell isn't really an artist that I've spent a ton of time with, especially when compared to others in the top 10, but she is an absolute legend, and this and 1976's Hejira are both classic albums. I see her influence on a lot of more modern singers singer-songwriters. The unorthodox yet accessible artistic style of a singer like Fiona Apple is a style that you can tell was definitely derived a little bit from Joni Mitchell. Anyway, I'm mostly happy with this pick as I know Blue is widely cherished by a lot of people and publications. Sidebar, it's great to see so many female artists in the top 10. You have Lauryn Hill's The Miseducation of Lauryn Hill, you have Joni Mitchell's Blue, and you have Fleetwood Mac's Rumors, even though the majority of Fleetwood Mac was male. I think Rolling Stone did a good job with that. Alright man, we're getting really heavy now, up to number 2. This is an album that has really grown in critical acclaim as it's aged. There's a number of albums from kind of the second half of the 60s that have had that happen. It was received in very lukewarm fashion when it came out in 1966, and that album is Pet Sounds by the Beach Boys. I just love it when artists take big steps forward and evolve a lot in a little bit of time. In the hip-hop world, we recently saw this with Tyler, the Creator. I always compared his ascendancy from this hateful, vulgar, young kid to an introspective, calculated artist to that of the Beach Boys evolution that culminated with Pet Sounds. They went from a slightly cheesy but still accessible and catchy surf rock band in the early part of the 60s to a band that made really serious, layered music with some candid lyrical themes. In the case of Pet Sounds, much of this can be attributed to lead singer-songwriter Brian Wilson and his state of mind at the time. He was apparently having trouble dealing with the fame that the Beach Boys had achieved and was going through a tough time, a period of drug addiction, and he was particularly involved with LSD, which may have led him to have a supposed spiritual awakening that led him to write some of the most intricate, progressive, and lush pop music that the world had ever heard. He was the main creative force behind really the entire album Pet Sounds, and it's kind of a cool little piece of lore in rock and music history that after hearing the Beatles' 1965 album Rubber Soul, Wilson kind of got inspired and determined and wanted to compete with the Beatles and release the best rock album of all time. I mean, Rolling Stone believes that Pet Sounds surpassed anything that the Beatles did. Spoiler alert, the Beatles aren't number 1. And personally, I don't think it's the second best album of all time, but I think Pet Sounds is pretty incredible. On the surface, it sounds like this mellow, lush, Baroque pop album that's pretty unassuming, but in reality, this is one of the most deep, most meaningful, and intricately constructed albums in the history of music. Some of the lyrical themes and musical forays and little details are too broad to mention here, but one thing is clear, Wilson gave the world an unfathomably awesome collection of such unique songs. He decided to use a ton of different instruments and sound effects. You hear things like a bicycle bell and high-pitched horn in You Still Believe in Me, and then you hear booming, low, almost distorted clarinets in the song I Know There's an Answer. The mood from song to song is pretty diverse. We get a beautiful, lush, loungy soundscape on the song Let's Go Away for a While. The group decided to cover a Caribbean folk song in Sloop John B, which seems like a completely random decision, honestly. And they did make subtle changes to the lyrics as kind of a nod to 60s LSD and psychedelic culture. One of the best moments on Pet Sounds is the song God Only Knows, which is widely celebrated as one of the best songs of all time. Wilson's lyrics and delivery are just so candid, and it shows kind of a downtrodden version of that familiar voice from good time surf rock classics from the early 60s. And while there are several songwriting credits by bandmates like Mike Love, Wilson once again wrote, arranged, composed, and delivered most of this thing on his own. Someone should write a book on the intricacies of Pet Sounds. I've heard it many times and I still don't quite understand it. It's one of the most dense, layered, and emotional albums of all time, and while it comes off as kind of unassuming, psychedelic, and almost like a novelty, it's just so much more than that. It goes so far beyond that. It did show the evolution of the Beach Boys as a band, and in Wilson's case, it kind of has a coming-of-age aspect to it. To go from Surf and Safari to Pet Sound in just 4 years, that's just an incredible evolution. While I just can't get on board with Pet Sounds being the second best album of all time, I do think it has endless replay value, which definitely adds to its aura. And I can understand why Rolling Stone puts it at number 2. And the number 1 album according to Rolling Stone, after 499 other albums from different genres, after countless albums that were missed or snubbed, after countless questionable picks, number 1 of all time is, if I was monetized, I'd put an ad here. Simply put, this is one of the most iconic and symbolic records in the history of music. It employs a very introspective and idealistic concept, all while utilizing some of the most well-executed, smooth, and progressive soul that I've ever heard. It's a quick hitter, and one track almost kind of runs into the next, sort of like a DJ mix, but there's no DJs in sight here. This is a concept album telling the story of a soldier returning from Vietnam, coming back to a society that was way more broken and changed for the worse since he went away to war a few years earlier. Here in the United States, the second half of the 60s 60s into the early 70s were one of the more turbulent times in our country's recent history, and the Vietnam War was arguably the centerpiece of it all. What's Going On tells the story of a soldier coming back after surviving hell on earth only to find society is just in shambles. Gaye executes this narrative perfectly, tackling issues like racism, poverty, self-inflicted suffering, and drug use. He even goes down as one of the first artists in history to raise environmental issues as a concern, long before global warming or climate change were part of society's everyday lexicon. Mercy, Mercy Me, which happens to be one of the most beautifully lush melodic cuts off of the album, addresses these environmental issues directly. Each track on here tells a story. Every track is important. There's really zero filler, although there is a little bit of a lull towards the middle of the album. While he gets a little bit too spiritual for my taste on God is Love and Holy Holy, and then there's kind of the awkward, idealistic Save the Children, the rest of the album is unbelievable. The title track opens the concept over a smooth yet serious groove that has become one of the most iconic songs in American history. What's Going On, Brother is a tribute to Marvin Gaye's brother that also addresses the mistreatment of war veterans who were coming home from Vietnam. Flying High in the Friendly Sky addresses drug addiction, namely heroin, which was becoming a bigger and bigger problem in American society by the early 70s. Right On has a nice touch of funk and salsa, and it's one of the groovier cuts off of the record. The album closes with the excellent Inner City Blues, which speaks about the urban decay and plight that was starting to take over at that time. It's probably one of the most stark, harrowing cuts on the album, and it doesn't really inherently come off as dark. The music is kind of smooth, accessible, and while it is a little bit emotional and melodic, the lyrics create just such a dark duality. It's no secret, What's Going On truly is one of the best albums of all time. It allowed one of the hardest working Motown artists to finally have his breakout after a decade plus in the music business. It's a beautiful album musically, and like most of the other albums on this list, it covers a number of different moods and ranges. It points out a lot of the ills of American society that existed at the time, many of which unfortunately are still big problems more than half a century later. It's honest, stark, but also accessible and inviting to the listener, allowing them easy access to Marvin Gaye's ambitious but effective concept. I'm glad to see this album at number 1, as it is truly one of those albums that does represent American culture more than pretty much anything else, for better or for worse. So for number 1, I think Rolling Stone got it right with Marvin Gaye's What's Going On. That's it. That's the list. We've come to the end. This is it. There's no more bonus content. I'm done for real. I had a lot of fun putting this series together. I encourage you to go back and check out all of the previous videos, maybe binge watch them. I'll link a playlist right here for easy access. That's it. Rolling Stone's 500 greatest albums of all time. I want to thank you for those who were on this journey with me from the start. Thank you to my entire audience. You guys are what keeps the channel going. I'm eternally grateful for your participation, support, and time, and I'm thankful that you tuned in for this series.